are listening to Stories from Palestine podcast, a podcast recorded in Palestine and about Palestine. My name is Crystal. I am originally from the Netherlands and I am married to a Palestinian. We live in Beit Safafa between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and we run Singer Cafe and Al Jisr Bar in Beit Sahur. Before moving to Palestine in 2013, I worked as a teacher and tour guide in the Netherlands. I have a degree in history and in tour guiding and many years of tour guiding experience. Due to the COVID pandemic, tourism in Palestine came to a complete halt, and that's why I started Stories from Palestine podcast in August 2020. This is the second year of the podcast, with every week on Monday a new episode about the history and heritage of Palestine, as well as the reality of life today. I hope you will enjoy today's episode. This week I asked on social media what topic you want me to talk about, and the overwhelming answer was the Mount of Olives, in Arabic Jabal al-Zaytun or At-Tur. And I was happy that you chose that subject, although I will also cover the other subjects that I mentioned in other podcast episodes. But I have recently visited many of the churches on the Mount of Olives, and I'm still preparing for the exam of the Ministry of Tourism that still didn't take place. And until today, the Palestinian Ministry of Tourism did not announce the date. So we are waiting for that to happen and keep reading and repeating, studying and preparing. So this is a good practice for me. The Mount of Olives, it has always been part of any pilgrimage program to Jerusalem. And before COVID pandemic hit, it was one of the busiest places around the old city of Jerusalem. What makes the Mount of Olives so important? It is important in all three monotheistic religions. It is a sacred place for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So let's dive into the history and the location of Jabal al-Zaytun, or the Mount of Olives. First of all, where is it exactly? If you look on a map, you will see that the Mount of Olives is to the east of the old city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself is also built on a hill, and all these hills where the old city of Jerusalem is and the hills around the old city, they are part of the mountain ridge that was pushed up by tectonic plate movements, and it goes from the north, from near Nablus, to the south, to near Hebron. This ridge of mountains has its highest peak in Halhul, which is near Hebron, where we can find the Mount Nabi Yunus, which is 1,030 meters high. This is, by the way, called after the prophet Jonah. Yunus is the prophet Jonah or Jonas, who is said to have lived there for about a year. Now, generally, the mountains of this mountain ridge are between 500 to 800 meters on average, and the Mount of Olives is around 800 meters. And if you are on the Mount of Olives, then you have one of the best views of the old city of Jerusalem. Most visitors go to the parking area in front of the Seven Arches Hotel on the top of the mountain, and they look out over the city with the Golden Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, on the Haram al Sharif, the noble sanctuary. And you can hear all about the Haram al Sharif in the first podcast episode of this season. You can also see the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and all the other churches, the domes, the towers, the city walls, the big gates. And when you look from up to the city, you can really realize that it was built on a hill. And Jerusalem, the old city, is surrounded by three valleys. So when you're looking from the Mount of Olives, you are looking down on a valley that is called the Kidron Valley. And to the south, it connects with another valley called the Hinnom Valley. And then the third valley is the Tyropian Valley, also called the Cheesemaker Valley. And nowadays it is called in Arabic El Wad, which is the Arabic for valley. And it is not anymore on the outside of the city. It became inside the city. It's now part of the old city, because the city expanded to the west. And you can see it clearly when you go to Damascus Gate. Then you have to walk down a lot of stairs because you are entering into the valley, into El Wad Street. And when you walk in El Wad Street, in the city center, from Damascus Gate down, then on either side, the connecting streets, you will see that they are climbing up because they're going from the valley up to the hills on which Jerusalem was built. So these valleys also play an important role in all the monotheistic religions, because it is for Jews, Christians and Muslims the place where the final day of judgment will happen. The Kidron Valley, the Hinnom Valley, this is the place where Jews expect the Messiah to come, where Christians expect Jesus to return, and where Muslims expect that the final day of judgment will happen. It is because the Jewish people believe that the deceased people will rise up from the death and then they will be judged, that they bury their death in the Kidron Valley. It has a huge Jewish cemetery. It is estimated that there are over 100,000 Jewish graves. So when you look at that cemetery, either from the top of the Mount of Olives looking down, or you can see them also from the road in the valley when you're looking up, you see thousands and thousands of white graves with the names of the people who are buried there on the slope of the mountain. And on the graves, you often see a small pile of stones. There are different explanations for why Jewish people place these stones on graves. It is an ancient tradition, and it is explained even among Jewish people in different ways. Some say that because the Jewish priests in ancient times would become impure if they came close to a dead body, that people would use stones to indicate where people were buried so that priests could stay away from those places. Another explanation is that it is believed that the soul dwells around the grave for a while after the person died, and that putting stones will keep the soul down in this world, which is comforting for some people. And also it is said that flowers and plants on a grave will eventually die, but stones will remain, and they are more important signs of respect for the dead than flowers. And another reason I've heard mentioning is that these stones will be used to rebuild the temple, which is an aspiration that some Jewish people have, or they believe that after the first and second temple were destroyed, that a third one will be built in Jerusalem, and they believe it must be built where the Dome of the Rock is located since 1400 years. So that causes a lot of tension in the city. Christians have the same Old Testament of the Bible as the Jews, so they also believe in a final day of judgment, in which the Mount of Olives plays an important role. The valley is mentioned in the Bible as the Valley of Jehoshaphat, or the Valley of the Kings. And according to Islam, on the final day of judgment, there will be a bridge that will be hanged between the Haram al Sharif and the Mount of Olives, the as-Sirat bridge. The bridge will be on a very thin line, and only true believers and righteous people will be able to cross and will be accepted by Allah. Now there's a stone round-shaped pillar in the wall of the Haram al Sharif. It's near the Golden Gate, or the Gate of Mercy. According to legend, that pillar is the place where the as-Sirat bridge will be hanged. And this pillar is also known as the Pillar of Muhammad. You can go and see it when you are in Jerusalem. In the Kidron Valley, which in Arabic is called Wadi al-Joz, by the way, which means the Valley of the Almonds, there are also several interesting ancient tombs that you can visit. There is a walking path that leads from the main road down into the valley, where you can see those tombs. And most of these ancient tombs date from the 1st century before Christ until around 70 after Christ, which is the year in which Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. In that time, about 2000 years ago, the way they used to bury dead people was that they dug into the rocks a long horizontal shaft, and then they would push the dead body into the shaft. And they would use a rolling stone to cover and seal off this shaft so that wild animals wouldn't be able to enter. And then after a while, they would come and collect the bones, and the bones would be placed in a stone box, an ossuary, and they could use the tomb again after that for another body. Now, this type of burial is called koch, or in plural kochim. This is in Hebrew. And these type of tombs were later, in Byzantine times, replaced by another kind of burial, which is called the arcosolia type of burial. And then the body would be laid on a kind of table in a niche that was cut out in the rock. And this is often how Christians later envisioned the burial of Jesus. But in the time of Jesus, the kochim tombs were the way of burial. So that is how Jesus was buried. And we know from the Bible story that there was a rolling stone in front of the cave, in front of the entrance, to protect it from wild animals. That's what we can read in the Bible, that the stone was rolled away to the side when Mary came to visit the tomb, and she saw that the body of Jesus was gone. But back to the Kidron Valley, where we find these interesting tombs, and some of them are for more important people in the community, so they had more decorated graves. Some of them had big funerary monuments, also called a nefesh. And the most well-known of these is the Absalom tomb. The Absalom tomb is about 22 meters high. It is a big square monolith, one piece of rock. It was hewn out from the limestone rock there on the same location, and it was decorated with a big conical roof. It looks a little bit like the Moroccan tagine, if you know that, like the cooking pots. Muslims also referred to it as the head of the pharaoh, el tantur pharaon, because of its shape. It's interesting because it is attributed to Absalom, who was the son of King David, but he lived in the 10th century before Christ, and the tomb is clearly from the 1st century before Christ. So this association with Absalom started much later. It's a tradition from the Crusader time, when the Crusaders were trying to find links between what they found in the Holy Land and the Bible stories. And probably it's based on a text in the 2nd book of Samuel in the Bible, in which we can read that Absalom, in his lifetime, set up a pillar for himself in the King's Valley because he didn't have sons to remember him. So when they read that and they saw this funerary monument, they said, oh, this must be Absalom's tomb. But Absalom died in the field. He was chased by Joab, the commander of the army of King David, and with his long hairs, he got stuck in the thick branches of an oak tree, and he was then killed and buried in the field, as it is described, under a heap of stones. And that was far away from Jerusalem. So it's very unlikely that this is the actual tomb of Absalom. So we've been talking about the valley that separates the Mount of Olives from the city. And I will start to tell you more about the Mount of Olives itself, but there is another interesting aspect to know about the valleys. So we have the Kidron Valley and the Hinnom Valley, and they have been associated also since the Canaanite time, the Bronze Age time, that is more than 3,000 years ago, with the worship of the Canaanite gods, to whom they sacrificed animals, but also children. And in the Bible, we read stories about the kings of Judah taking part in such sacrificial events to the Canaanite god called Moloch. And the prophet Jeremiah, he cursed the location for these practices. And throughout the history, this location, this valley, became the symbol of divine punishment. And the Hinnom Valley, that is also called the Gehinnom Valley or Gehenna, it became synonymous for hell. So imagine, we have the holy city on the top of Jerusalem, symbolizing heaven, and then down in the valley, the dark valley in the shadow of the city, there was the hell for the godless and the evil people. So as you can hear, this area, the Mount of Olives and the Kidron and Hinnom Valley, they are very important in the three monotheistic religions. And therefore they are very much visited by all kinds of pilgrims. When you want to visit the Mount of Olives, the easiest way to do it is to start from the top, because then you can walk down. If you do it the other way around, it's quite a climb. That's actually what we did a couple of weeks ago. And if you're fit, it's okay. But otherwise, I would say start from the top. You can go there by public transportation, by bus, or you can take a taxi. And then you can walk down and you visit all the different sites without too much effort. So let's start on the top of the Mount of Olives. There is a Russian church on the top of the Mount of Olives called the Church of the Ascension. The Church of the Ascension commemorates the story of the ascension of Jesus, who rose up from the Mount of Olives into heaven. And because of this event, there are several churches on the Mount of Olives dedicated to this event. And as we see more often in the Holy Land, there are always different locations that are indicated to be the place of a certain Bible story. And that's partially because traditions sometimes changed over time. Sometimes certain places would be considered to be more accurate, or sometimes it was just more convenient for pilgrims to change the location to a place that was closer to another location that they wanted to visit. And also because the different Christian denominations wanted to have their own location with their own churches and chapels. So we see a Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox and the Catholic and sometimes a Lutheran church dedicated to the same event on different places but close to each other. This is the Russian Church of Ascension on the top, and it has a 64 meters high tower. This is one of the landmarks that you can see from a far distance. It's noticeable from all sides of Jerusalem, together with the tower of the Augusta Victoria Hospital and the buildings of the Hebrew University. The church itself was built in the 19th century, and it was built by Russia under the Archimandrite Kapustin. It was the first church in Jerusalem that had a bell in a bell tower that was allowed to ring, the first time during the late Ottoman period that the church could ring its bell again. And the bell was huge. It was 8 tons. It was brought from Russia and it came to the port in Jaffa. And then a group of pilgrims pulled the 8-ton bell on a cart from Jaffa to Jerusalem. That must have been a hell of a job. Behind this church, there is another chapel, and this chapel is dedicated to John the Baptist. It is said that they found a jar buried under the ground that contained the head of John the Baptist. John the Baptist had been killed, beheaded by Herod Antipas, and there are several other locations where they claim that they have the head of John the Baptist, including Damascus, in Rome, in Amiens in France, and also in Germany, in Munich. And there are even more locations where they claim to have other body parts of John the Baptist. In Palestine, the oldest tradition for the burial of John the Baptist is in Sebastia. And I spoke about that in the episode on Jacob's well and Sebastia last year. So that's at the Russian Church of Ascension. Now, before we continue the tour and see more churches that are related to the ascension of Jesus, let's read that story from the Bible. And I found it very interesting to realize that the story is only really mentioned in the book of Acts and not in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And even in the book of Acts, it's only a few lines. So I will read them for you. After Jesus said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men, dressed in white, stood beside them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why do you stand here looking into the sky? this same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. And that's it. That's all there's written about the ascension of Jesus. But it was the inspiration of many paintings and many artworks and for big churches on the Mount of Olives. The very first church that was built on the Mount of Olives was built in the 4th century. And it was built by the mother of Emperor Constantine, Queen Helena. She also built the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem and gave order for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And the first church was called the Eleona Church. And Eleona comes from the Greek word elion, which means olive. And the Mount of Olives is named so because of the many olive trees that this mountain once had. But over time, many of the trees were cut already by the Roman army in the years that they besieged Jerusalem, which was between 67 and 70 AD. That's when they razed the complete city. They had their legions stationed around the city that they were besieging. And they used up the olive trees for firewood, for other purposes, for their large army. So the olive trees of that day have not survived the time, even though we know that olive trees can become very old. There are several olive trees that are over 2,000 years old. And in Al-Walaja, close to Bethlehem, there is an olive tree that is probably over 4,000 years old. So the only trees we see now on the Mount of Olives are the ones in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we will talk about that later, and some in the gardens of churches or at the homes of people in their gardens. But Mount of Olives is not a mount full of olives anymore. So the location of this first church, the Eleona Church, is just a little bit down from the Russian Church of Ascension. But it's not anymore the place where the Ascension is commemorated, because over time the tradition on this location changed and it became known as the place where Jesus taught his apostles to pray the Our Father prayer. Inside the church area, there is a cave that is venerated as the place where Jesus would take his apostles and then teach them how to pray. And he taught them to pray, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And today, if you visit this church, which is called the Pater Noster Church, which is Our Father in Latin, you can find this prayer in 140 different languages on the walls on ceramic tiles. So you can learn the Our Father prayer in 140 different languages. The property with the cave and the remains of the first church, the first Eleona Church, were bought in 1868 by a French princess. Her name is Aurélie de Bossy de la Tour d'Auvergne. And then she built a Carmelite convent there. And she donated the property to France, and now you can see the French flag waving over the church building, just like the Saint Anne Church in the Old City and the Benedictine Monastery in Abu Roche. They are all French properties. And the princess herself was also buried in the church. So inside the cloister of the convent, you can see her sarcophagus, and she was buried there after she died in Florence in 1889. Now, not far from the Pater Noster Church, still on the top of the Mount of Olives, actually on the highest point, there is the current Church of the Ascension. It has an octagonal shape and it dates back to the Crusader time. And this building, the building that we see today, was actually only the edicule that was in the center of the church. So the church itself was much larger and did not remain. So the building that you see now, the small building, is an edicule. And what is that? If you've been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you can imagine it. Otherwise, you have to envision that in the middle of the church, there is a structure that is built around a sacred place. In the case of the Holy Sepulchre Church, it is built around the tomb of Jesus. And in this case, the edicule was built around a stone that had the footprint of Jesus of the time that he ascended into heaven. At least that is what they say. There is a stone and you can kind of see a footprint on the stone, which is supposedly Jesus' footprint when he ascended to heaven. So this location that became the new venerated place after the tradition changed from the cave that I mentioned earlier, the one that became known for teaching of the prayer, was the new location, and probably pilgrims changed the location because they envisioned that the ascension of Jesus must have happened on the highest top of the mountain. So they changed it to the highest top of the mountain. And it was the Empress Poimenia who gave orders to build the first church, and that was in the late 4th century. Now, that church didn't survive. Most churches in Palestine did not survive the Persian attacks in 614. The Persians came in and destroyed most of the churches and monasteries, except for the Nativity Church. And then the Crusaders built a new church. And what remains now, the edicule that we see today, is from that time, the Crusader time. In 1187, a year to remember, one of those years that you should remember, Salah ad-Din took the city, and then he converted the site into a mosque. He added a prayer niche, a mihrab, but he still allowed Christians to come and visit the place. The Muslims built a new mosque next door, and until today, the site is visited both by Muslims and Christians. Next to it, there is a newer mosque that was built in the 17th century, and it was built by the Mufti, the judge of judges in the Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful men. His name was Sheikh Assad, and he built the Zawiya al-Asadiyya that contains a small room inside with the tomb of Rabi' al-Adawiyya. And Rabi' al-Adawiyya is a very famous Sufi mystic. She came originally from Basra in current-day Iraq. She was the 4th daughter in a very poor family, and she was sold into slavery. And later, when she was freed, she continued to live a very ascetic lifestyle. She did many miracles. She wrote poetry, and she is said to have lived in Jerusalem for a while. And she's a great example for many Muslims in general, but especially for Sufis. Now from here, if you continue the street on the top of the Mount of Olives, you will reach to the Augusta Victoria. And what is the Augusta Victoria? It's a hospital. It has also a church, also dedicated to the ascension of Jesus, but this is a Lutheran church. It is named after the wife of the Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II, who visited Jerusalem in 1898. That's when they removed a part of the old city wall near the Jaffa Gate. The opening that you see there until today was made so that they could enter into the city without having to get out of their chariots. And then they could be brought in style to their hotel, the new Imperial Hotel, which still exists until today. And during their visit, the Ottomans gifted some land for the emperor, and he decided to build a guest house on it for pilgrims. And the Augusta Victoria building was the first modern building in Jerusalem that had its own generator and that had warm water. It wasn't used as a pilgrim's house for a very long time, because in the First World War it became the headquarters of the Turkish military. And in 1917, it became headquarters for the British Army. And in 1920, the British Mandate took it as their government house, with Herbert Samuel having his headquarters there. And then when he moved later to a new location, they used the building for British soldiers to have some space to rest and relax. After 1948, the Nakba, the building was also used to host Palestinian refugees. It was a shelter and a distribution center. It was run by the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, the UNRWA, and the International Red Cross and the Lutheran World Federation. And they turned it into a hospital. It had 450 beds. And eventually the owner, which was the Augusta Victoria Foundation, transferred the building and the land to the Lutheran World Federation. So now there is a hospital and a German Protestant church, the Church of the Ascension, which has a 50-meter high bell tower, also one of the landmarks of Jerusalem. And furthermore, there is a meeting center for pilgrims and tourists. There is a kindergarten, an inter-religious kindergarten, and a cafe, a nice location. And it has a branch of the German Protestant Institute of Archaeology. So now it's time that we start moving down. So from the top of the Mount of Olives, from near the Pater Noster Church, where we were before in our virtual visit, we are now going down towards the Kidron Valley. And on our way down, we will pass by several other churches that are always visited by pilgrims. The first one that we see is the Dominus Flevit Church. And that's Latin, and if you translate it into English, it means the Lord wept. This is the place where the pilgrims remember that Jesus looked at Jerusalem and he cried because he knew that the city would be destroyed. It would be completely destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And this is described in the book of Luke in chapter 19. I will read it for you. And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "Would that even you had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children with you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." So he's talking about the city, about Jerusalem itself. The church that you see here is a very small church. It's more like a chapel, but it's very special. It was built in 1955, and it was built by Antonio Barluzzi. And I want you to remember this name. Antonio Barluzzi was an Italian Franciscan architect who built many churches in the Holy Land. He is very well known, and when you visit Palestine as a pilgrim or as an interested person, you will see several of his churches for sure. What makes his architecture so special is that each church has a design that symbolizes the story to which the church was dedicated. So in this case, he made the shape of the church as the shape of a teardrop with tear files on the four corners of the dome. And when you come inside, you will also notice that the church is not oriented to the east, which is usual in churches, but it is oriented to the west. And when you sit in the church and you look at the altar, behind it you are looking through a window that looks out over Jerusalem, just like Jesus was looking towards Jerusalem when he wept. And it is a very famous view. The window with the decorative wrought iron bars that depict a cup and a loaf and thorns and a cross. And in the dome up, you can see several reliefs from the life of Jesus. And one of them depicts Jesus sitting on the donkey when he came from Bethphage and he drove towards Jerusalem, and he was welcomed by the people of Jerusalem who thought that he was going to deliver them from the Romans, from the Roman occupation. And this story, that he came on a donkey and that he was welcomed by the people as a king, is the fulfillment of a prophecy from the Old Testament by the prophet Zechariah that was done hundreds of years before the event, who said that the king, the Messiah, would arrive on a donkey. And when Jesus came down from the Mount of Olives, he saw that the people were making way for him, covering the street with branches of the palm trees. And that is why, until today, you still see on Palm Sunday a procession starting on the top of Mount of Olives, going down to the city. Pilgrims coming together, singing hymns and carrying those palm branches and going down through the Via Dolorosa to the Holy Sepulchre Church. Before we leave the Dominus Flevit Church, there's one more thing to mention, which is the mosaic on the altar of the church, depicting a hen and chicken. And this refers to the text from Luke 13, where Jesus says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." So there's another lamentation of Jesus over the city of Jerusalem. Now we will continue down the Mount of Olives, and we will see the golden onion-shaped domes of the Mary Magdalene Church. There are 7 golden domes. They reflect the sunlight. They are typical Russian style because this is another Russian Orthodox church. And this church is dedicated to Mary of Magdalene. She was one of Jesus' followers. She came from a town called Magdala, near the Lake of Galilee, and it is said that she was possessed by demons and that Jesus cured her. And then she followed him, and with some other women, she took care of Jesus, and she really understood his message. She was one of the 3 women who stayed with him when he was crucified. And she was also the first one who visited the tomb and discovered that the tomb was empty. The church itself was built by Tsar Alexander III in 1888, and it was built in honor of his mother, Maria Alexandrovna. Inside the church, you can see a huge painting of Mary Magdalene, and we see her with the Emperor Tiberius, and she's presenting him a red egg. The story behind this painting is that after Jesus had been crucified, she met with the emperor and she wanted to accuse him. She wanted to tell him how wrong the Romans had been to have killed Jesus. But in the same time, she wanted to show that Jesus was victorious over his death, that he was resurrected. And as a symbol of resurrection and of new life, she held up an egg and she told him, "Christ is risen." Now the emperor was not impressed. He was laughing at her and he told her that there was about as much chance of a human being returning to life from the dead as there was of that egg turning red. And of course, the egg promptly turned red. So that's why we see many icons painted with Mary holding a red egg. In this church, there are also some celebrities buried. One of them is Elizabeth of Hesse-Darmstadt. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and she was the sister of the last Russian empress, who was called Elizabeth Feodorovna in Russian. She was married to the brother of the Tsar, and after her husband died, she became a nun, and then during the Bolshevik Revolution she was killed together with another nun called Barbara Yakovleva, and both of them were later canonized as holy martyrs, and they were buried in this church. And the reason why Prince Charles and Prince William of England come to visit this church when they are in Jerusalem is because the grandmother of Prince Charles and the great-grandmother of Prince William is buried here as well. She is known as Princess Alice of Battenberg, or Alice of Greece, because she lived in Greece for a longer period of time. That's where she also helped a lot of poor people and Jewish people during the World War. And she had said that she had wanted to be buried next to her aunt in this church. So that is what happened. And her body was eventually brought here. Today, this church is run by 30 nuns from all over the world, and they are known for their hand-painted eggs that you can buy, embroideries and other crafts that they sell to sustain their community. All right, now we will continue to the last 2 stops. First, the Garden of Gethsemane, which will sound familiar to people who know the story of the last night of Jesus on the Mount of Olives. Jesus had had his Passover meal in the city, in the upper room, And then he took his apostles outside of the gate, outside of the city wall, to the Mount of Olives, to a place that was called Gethsemane. And this is an Aramaic word, and it means olive press, because there were many olive trees and olives were pressed for olive oil. And then Jesus went to pray, and he told his disciples to stay awake and to stay on watch. But they were tired and they kept falling asleep. And Jesus prayed the following. He said, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass me by. Nevertheless, let it be as you, not I, would have it." And then a little while later he said, "If this cup cannot pass by, but I must drink it, your will be done." And he said this prayer 3 times, and each time he went to check on the disciples and he found them asleep. And then he said about them, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Now today, if you visit the gardens of Gethsemane, you will enter into a courtyard that is surrounded by a wall. And inside the courtyard, there are 8 old olive trees. And right next to it is the Church of the Agony, which is built by the same architect I mentioned before, Barluzzi, the one who designed the Dominus Flevit. It's called the Church of the Agony because it remembers that Jesus was suffering. He's even said to have been sweating drops of blood. The olive trees in the garden do not date back to the time of Jesus. An Italian university carried out a research that lasted for more than 3 years, and they finally established that the trees are about 900 years old, which means that they date back to the Crusader time. But what is interesting is that they also found, through DNA analysis, that the trees all had an identical genotype. And this indicates that they probably originated from a common parent tree. So it suggests that the trees were originally branches that were cut from a larger tree and then were grown into new trees, which probably was done because they wanted to sustain the lineage of these trees. So they think that during Crusader time, they were trying to revive the garden and they built a new church, and they have taken from the old trees some branches to replant them. So they may have a relation to the older trees, and who knows, to the trees that were already present in Jesus' time. Inside the Church of the Agony, there is a rock, a natural rock, bedrock, where they say that Jesus prayed. It is not the first church that was built over this rock. It's actually the 3rd one. First, a Byzantine church was built here, later a Crusader church, and this church was built in the 1950s by Barluzzi. And in his design, he tried to evoke that night time, the night time of the agony of Jesus. So it's a very dark church. There are windows, but the natural light is filtered through violet blue alabaster windows. And the church has a ceiling with 12 domes. And in the domes, we recognize the night sky with painted stars and also with olive branches, symbolizing that we are in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the 12 small domes are each one of them attributed to one of the nations that helped to finance the church. And that's why this church is also known as the Church of Nations. During my last visit to the church, I spoke to one of the Palestinian guards who told me that he was present during an arson attack that happened in 2020, in December 2020, when a Jewish Israeli man came into the church and he had a liquid that he set on fire. Thanks God there wasn't a lot of damage and nobody was injured. But the guard mentioned to me that people often think that the Christians in Palestine are under attack and under threat by Muslims. But he says that the biggest threat actually are the radical settlers, the radical Zionist settlers who are regularly attacking Christian properties in Jerusalem. And it's interesting to realize that some of the holy sites in Jerusalem are shared between Christians and Muslims. I mentioned the Church of Ascension on the top of the mountain, and the last site that I will describe for you in this podcast episode is also such a place. It is the tomb of the Virgin Mary. It's located at the foot of the Mount of Olives. And from the street level, you have to go down some stairs. Then you reach a plaza in front of the entrance to the tomb. And then you enter through a typical Crusader arched entrance. And you go down even more steps under the ground through a wide vaulted arched stairway, which leads into the cave where they venerate Mother Mary. And Mother Mary, according to tradition, did not die. She was brought by the apostles to this place, and then what happened was what they call the Assumption. She was taken to heaven by God. She just disappeared. And the bench where she was sitting became the place of veneration. And it's a very early Christian tradition. In the 5th century, there was already a Byzantine church here, and later a Crusader church was constructed over the cave. But in its origin, and this is probably one of the oldest and original churches in Jerusalem, and just like in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, also here at Mary's tomb, we can see an edicule in the middle of the space, and inside the edicule is the stone bench that is venerated as the bench where Mary sat. Just like in the Holy Sepulchre, they have the edicule with inside the place where they say that Jesus was laid when he was buried. And also similar is that in order to circle around the tomb area, they have cut out the rocks. They removed the stones around it so that pilgrims can now walk around that holy spot. So there is a big similarity between the tomb of Mary and the Holy Sepulchre Church. And then in Muslim era, under Salah ad-Din, the tomb became also a Muslim holy site. And Muslims used to come and pray. You can still see the mihrab that was added, which is the prayer niche that gives the direction towards Mecca. And a legend tells that the Prophet Muhammad, on his night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, when he ascended up into the heavens, on his journey, he came by this place and he saw a light shining from this cave. So when we visited last time, we saw a Muslim man coming down into the cave to pray. And it was funny because he asked the Orthodox priest to take some photos and videos of him while he was praying. And I thought it was a very special moment. And last but not least, in this church, in a chapel, Queen Melisande was buried. She was the daughter of King Baldwin II, the second Crusader king, and she ruled for a while on her own, and then later also with her son, and she was buried here in the Crusader time. She was of Armenian descent, and she was one of the few women that ruled Jerusalem. Now, I'm fully aware that this is not a complete description of the places on the Mount of Olives. There are several places that I haven't mentioned, and there are a lot of details that I didn't mention. But eventually, we cannot make the podcast too long. So if you want to visit Jerusalem, you can easily spend a full day just visiting the Mount of Olives before even entering into the Old City. If you loved this episode, then pay attention, because I want to make a nice video about the sites on the Mount of Olives, and I will make it available for those of you who do a donation to the podcast. And you can do that on Ko-fi. You can click the link in the show notes and follow the instructions there. And then when the video is ready, I will email you the link so that you can see everything I spoke about and watch it at home from the comfort of your chair. Although, of course, we hope that one day you will come to see all of this for yourself. Thank you for listening to Stories from Palestine. If you enjoy the podcast, then here are several things you can do to support the show. Tell your friends about the podcast. share some of the social media posts on Instagram or Facebook, start following the YouTube channel. You can also hear the podcast audio there, and soon I will start uploading videos. Sign up for the email list so that you get a reminder with a clickable link to the new podcast episode, and in the future you will be updated about programs and trips that I will start to organize. And of course, you can donate to help me pay for hosting the podcast and the website and all the related recording costs. It's the only source of income I have at the moment, so you can imagine how much I appreciate every cup of coffee or falafel sandwich that you buy me on the Ko-fi platform. All the links that you need can be found in the show notes and on the website storiesfrompalestine.info. That's it. I hope you will tune in again next week. If you enjoy listening to Stories from Palestine podcast, then I think you will also enjoy listening to my favorite podcast, which is called Jerusalem Unplugged. You can find it on most podcast players and on social media at Jerusalem Unplugged.